y'all, let's find some historical fiction books to put on your TBR, and perhaps more important, let's find some books to maybe cross off your TBR, because I'm going to talk about some books here that I read recently, some historical fiction books that I didn't really like, and after you listen to me talk about them, maybe you will decide that you don't want to read them either. These are all popular books or books that I see quite a bit on BookTube. Now I'm going to describe these books in such a way that you will know if they're the right book for you, because I always like to say, just because I didn't like a book, that doesn't mean you're not going to like a book. Everyone's got their own reading taste, and at the same time, just because I don't like a book, that doesn't mean that it's not a good book. It just means it wasn't the right book for me. So first, let's talk about The Physician by Noah Gordon. So this is a book about a boy who was born in London in the Middle Ages, and as he grows up, he decides he wants to become a physician, which isn't something that you can really become unless you go to schools in the Middle East and learn how to become a physician, because out in Europe, you're basically just going to be a barber, right? You're going to be somebody who's selling, quack medicinal products and at the same time trying to help people heal as much as you can possibly know how. So in this book, the main character, he makes his way out to Persia to go to one of the famous medical schools out there. So while I thought this book was interesting in terms of what I learned about in terms of early medicine in Europe during the Middle Ages, as well as during the Middle East, which was obviously much more advanced in the Middle Ages than Europe, I would say that for me, this book sort of fell into the trap of where you didn't really have any narrative tension. It was more just the author saying, the character did this, and then he did this, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But there was no true narrative arc. There was no true narrative tension, and while the character did want something, I never felt like ultimately the character wasn't going to get what he wanted. So that's why I didn't like it. But, if you don't mind when a book is written like that, this could be a good book for you. The next popular historical fiction book that I read recently was Into the Wilderness by Sarah Donati. So this book is about a woman who travels over to the early Americas from England, and she falls in love with a white man who basically is known as someone who is between two lives. So he is a white man, but he basically lives as the Native Americans live. Now, what's interesting about this book is, as I was reading it, I kept thinking to myself, wow, this really reminds me of Outlander. So I actually Googled a little bit about this book, and I guess it is actually Outlander fan fiction, which makes sense because I wouldn't actually classify this book as historical fiction. To me, it was basically just historical romance / fan fiction, and I felt like the characters were just way too modern in how they thought. So the main character, Elizabeth, she was so modern in her thinking that I felt like she basically was like a 21st century woman. But if you are someone who loved Outlander and who doesn't mind fan fiction and who doesn't mind, something that's flavored as historical fiction but isn't really, then you might actually really like Into the Wilderness. I would just say that for me, I was probably just expecting one thing and then it turned out to be something else. Next up, let's talk about Clear by Karis Davies. Now, this book is about what is called the Scottish clearances, which is basically what happened in the 1840s in Scotland when there was all these Scottish islands and anybody who was still living there was basically evicted from their home by the British government. So this story is about an impoverished minister, John, and he basically accepts the job to clear out the last remaining inhabitant of a particular island. His name is Ivor. He's a Scottish guy. They don't speak the same language. Ivor speaks Gaelic. John speaks English. And when John arrives at the island, he gets into an accident. And Ivor essentially has to come to his rescue. Now, this is a short book, very well written, very beautiful book. And there is kind of a twist at the ending that I didn't see coming. Overall, I would say that this book is definitely worth your time because it's short, very well written, and overall just a really interesting book. Next up is The Winter Soldier by Daniel Mason. Now, this is a World War I historical fiction book. It is about a Polish guy, and he wants to be a doctor, but when World War I starts, he basically is just told, hey, now you're a doctor because you basically know enough to be a doctor. So he's sent somewhere very remote on the Eastern Front where he meets and falls in love with a mysterious nurse, and he also starts to come into contact with soldiers who have what is known as shell shock, although people didn't really understand what this was back then. But basically, the conditions of World War I were so horrific toxic that basically, you know, if you were in it for long enough, you basically just went insane. And so you have these soldiers who are absolutely insane. So the main character of this novel is dealing with this new sort of mental disease that he's trying to figure out, as well as a bunch of other stuff that's going on the far eastern front in World War I. Overall, I thought this was a very interesting book. The author, Daniel Mason, he actually is a doctor himself, so I thought he did a good job of making the medicine in the book very interesting, as well as, you know, attainable to the layman. I also thought the book had a very clever ending, so it was just overall very good. Next up is House of Spirits by Isabel Allende. So this is a multi-generational story that is also a historical fiction novel, and it tells the story of the country of Chile, its history from about World War I on into the presidential coup that happened in, I believe, 1973. And this story of Chile is told through the eyes of the Trueba family. And while the country of Chile is never expressly actually mentioned ever in the story, it's obvious that this is the country that Isabel Allende is talking about, just because of the historical events and also because that's the country where she's from. I would say overall this was a very beautifully written book. It's considered a modern classic, and I can definitely see why. It was just a beautiful book and very poignant, especially at the end. The only thing that I would say, and this really isn't a critique of the book itself, it's mostly just a critique of, you know, any book that is told from a multi-generational perspective. I feel like a lot of times, at least for me, I don't get to know each character enough where, you know, they kind of feel a little flat. But I think that's mostly just because it's a multi-generational story. I would say, though, that I would not recommend the recording. That's how actually I read this book, and I really did not like the narrator. She just had the most weird intonation. She would just, I don't know, if you say, I don't know, any sentence, she would be like, and then she went to the store and found that they were going home. It was just so bizarrely read. So I would definitely recommend reading this one. The next up is Hello Beautiful by Ann Napolitano. Now I know technically this isn't, I don't know, historical fiction because it's near history, right? It basically deals with the 1960s on up into the 1980s. And it's essentially a modern retelling of Little Women. Now I will say that I enjoyed this book, but one critique that I had of this book is that I thought it kind of put modern sensibilities about mental health in particular into the 1980s. Now, I grew up in the 1980s, and I feel like how people thought about mental health back then was, you know, if you're depressed, it's like, well, get over it. I mean, that's your problem. What are you going to do about it, essentially? I mean, that's how people thought about mental health back then. So I thought it was a little strange. I almost thought that it should have been written in the 2000s or the 2020s and not the 1980s. I feel like if it had been written as a modern novel and not a quasi-historical fiction novel, then I would have liked it a lot more. Next up is Dragonfly by Leila Meacham. So this is essentially a World War II historical fiction novel. It is a spy novel. It's about a group of Americans who are spies in Paris. Now I was really excited about this novel because, you know, I just wanted to get some Paris vibes, but I thought that that was one of the things that I didn't like about the novel, is that there was no real sense of place. I felt like it could have happened literally anywhere. Never at all did I feel like the characters were in Paris. I also felt like each character was exactly the same. Each character was an incredibly good-looking, incredibly intelligent, and incredibly noble and brave spy, an American spy. So ultimately, I actually didn't even finish this book because I didn't really care. And then last up is Becoming Mrs. Lewis by Patty Callahan. Now I read this book because I really loved The Secret Book of Flora Lee. Now this book, I felt like it was almost the author's first try at writing a novel. I did not think it was anywhere near as successful as The Secret Book of Flora Lee, and maybe it actually was the author's first ever book, but it's essentially a book about the woman, the American woman, who would eventually go on to become C.S. Lewis's wife. Now, I definitely feel that this book is worth reading if you are interested in the subject, but I did feel that maybe it just lacked the narrative tautness that maybe The Secret Book of Flora Lee had. So there we go. I hope you have some books that you can put on your TBR, or maybe you can cross some books off your TBR after watching this video. And as always, happy reading.